In 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act into law. The act helped create the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. You know it today as OSHA. The act also gave states the opportunity to create and enforce their own health and safety regulations with a state-approved plan. A state-approved plan permits the federal government to turn over all enforcement, consultative services, and the collection of fines to the state. It also allows the state to enforce the non-compliance of employers using legal means, fines, and punitive actions that could go even as far as shutting down businesses for the most egregious violations. In 1988, Virginia received final approval as a state-approved plan. You may know the plan by the name Virginia OSHA, or VOSH. VOSH rules are nearly identical to the federal OSHA standards, but very recently VOSH took legislative action to enact an emergency temporary standard to address COVID-19. 16 Virginia Administrative Code 25-220 is the emergency temporary standard that was enacted. On July 27th, VOSH has prescribed some detailed requirements for all employers in the Commonwealth to comply with the new standard to prevent the spread of the virus in the workplace. The enactment of this new emergency temporary standard is the first of its kind in the United States to cover COVID-19 prevention in the workplace. This training covers the requirements of the new emergency standard. It isn't likely to be anything new or shocking from your day-to-day actions and safe behaviors that you haven't already learned or received in the workplace since the beginning of the pandemic. But now is a good time to organize what is required so that you understand the COVID-19 prevention requirements at Stewart's Draft. Under the new standard, there are 3 areas that need to be communicated to employees. We'll cover the mandatory prevention requirements for all employers in the Commonwealth, the exposure risk level determination for Stewart's Draft, and the mandatory prevention methods to address medium exposure risk level determination at Stewart's Draft. The first area to discuss is the mandatory prevention requirements for all employers in Virginia that are covered by VOSH. Number 1, perform a hazard assessment to determine COVID-19 exposure. Number 2, communicate and encourage employees to self-monitor for signs of the illness. The third mandatory requirement is to develop and implement procedures for employees to report symptoms when they suspect it's with COVID-19. Number 4 is to implement procedures to prevent and prohibit suspected COVID-19 employees from remaining at work. And number 5 is assure a sick leave policy is intact and flexible. Number 6 is Hershey's requirement to communicate the importance and prohibitions of working at Stewart's Draft with the temporary employee workforce. Number 7 is to identify a central person for employees to notify or communicate COVID-19 reports and activities. That would be Jennifer Barton in Human Resources. Number 8 is to notify employees of the occurrence of positive COVID-19 cases, but absolutely maintain compliance with employee confidentiality. Number 9 is to notify OSHA upon the discovery of 3 or more employees that work in the same area having tested positive for COVID-19 in the previous 14-day period. Number 10 is Hershey's requirement to develop a return-to-work policy and procedure for known or suspected employees of COVID-19, whether they're symptomatic or asymptomatic. Number 11 is Hershey's requirement to assure physical distancing is occurring in the work area, during breaks, and while on Hershey property. We do that using verbal announcements, signage, or visual cues to promote social distancing. We're also required to limit non-employee access to Hershey property. Number 12 is to reconfigure or stagger the usage of common areas, break rooms, or lunchrooms to attain that social distancing through reduced density of congregation. We have to establish, enforce, and post the occupancy limits in congregational areas to assure social distancing is occurring. Number 13 is to require employees to clean and disinfect their area prior to leaving or provide for cleaning and disinfecting at regular intervals throughout the day. We're also required, number 14, to make available hand washing facilities and hand sanitizer stations throughout the facility. Number 15 is when 2 or more Hershey employees occupy a company vehicle, then all occupants of the vehicle must wear face coverings. Number 16, where the nature of the employee's work can't possibly allow the observance of social distancing, then barriers such as face shields must be used in addition to face coverings. Number 17, areas where known or suspected COVID-19 cases have occurred must be cleaned and disinfected. Number 18, common spaces such as bathrooms and doors must be cleaned a minimum at the end of each shift. This includes shared tools that could be transferred from one employee to another. That's it. 18 mandatory prevention requirements from Virginia OSHA for all employers covered by Virginia OSHA in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, there are other requirements, so let's keep going. The second area of communication for employees to cover is the exposure risk level determination for Stewart's Draft. Exposure risk level means an assessment of the possibility that an employee at Stewart's Draft could be exposed to the hazards associated with COVID-19 disease. The exposure assessment results have been divided into 4 exposure levels: very high, high, medium, and lower. A very high exposure are job tasks in places of employment with high potential for employee exposure to known or suspected sources of COVID-19. This includes things like medical, post-mortem, or laboratory areas. You can imagine in these professions the risk of exposure to COVID-19 is very high. A high exposure are those places of employment with high potential for employee exposure inside 6 feet with a known or suspected source of COVID-19, such as field hospitals, healthcare facilities, first responders, and even mortuary services that prepare burial and cremation. A medium exposure are those places of employment that have tasks not classified as very high or high, but may require minimal contact within the 6 feet of other employees, persons, or the general public that could be or may be infected or suspected of being infected with COVID-19. In this category, it includes places such as poultry, meat, and seafood processing facilities, transportation of passengers by air, land, and water, educational settings like colleges, universities, and schools. It also includes manufacturing settings, and Hershey Stewart's Draft is in this category. The lower risk category is the final category because it doesn't qualify under the previous 3, very high, high, or medium risk. It's because there is a minimal occupational contact with employees, other persons, or general public in their work environment. This type of worker often includes an office environment setting. To recap the risk categories, they are very high, high, medium, and lower risk. At Stewart's Draft, we fall into the medium risk category. Let's talk about mandatory requirements for the medium risk category. Mandatory requirements for Hershey due to the medium risk, in addition to the mandatory requirements already discussed, include pre-screening workers before each shift, implementing flexible worksite to the extent feasible, like telework or remote work, implementation of staggered shift flexible work hours, staggered work shifts, and when necessary, use downsizing operations and other exposure-reducing workplace control measures, establish social distancing at 6 feet, and install physical barriers where feasible to mitigate the spread. Implementation of flexible meeting and travel options. Better yet, postpone non-essential travel or events. Promote frequent and thorough hand washing to employees, all employees, and maintain regular housekeeping practices that include cleaning and disinfecting surfaces and equipment. Communicate and educate visitors and guests of the COVID-19 protection requirements at Stewart's Draft. Require face coverings of everyone and develop a written infectious disease preparedness and response plan for the facility. That takes us to the end of the COVID-19 training areas required of the Emergency Temporary Standard. As a recap, we've covered all business requirements for all employers of the Commonwealth, the risk assessment process, and the medium risk requirements as a result of our exposure at Stewart's Draft.